I would like to take you through half a century of being in Africa, half a century of change in Africa, of which, as has been said before, 40 years were there for me to report on. My perception of the African world is shaped very much by my daily experiences in Kenya, where I live, and of course, by my many professional trips, duties, which has taken me to nearly all countries of the continent in these 40 years to half a century. On my first trip to Kenya in 1973, I saw only a few cars. Actually, there were more giraffes and zebras on the road than there were cars at that time. Nairobi was a garden city, and only around 5 o'clock, the only traffic light, there was a traffic jam lasting for 5 minutes in the afternoon. It was still a time when you could find a leopard in your kitchen store. Kenya was an agricultural country with 13 million inhabitants. These days we have 55 to 60 million inhabitants in Kenya. Terms like Africa optimism and Africa pessimism, really, as far as I know, they have never been used in Africa itself. These are views given by outsiders to the continent. But it can be said that in the 70s, when I came first to Africa, there was a kind of positive mood. There was still confidence, still only a few years after independence. The journalistic approach was still very colonial, I have to admit, in retrospect. The Western mind still had to be decolonized. Preconceived ideas about Africa, Africa's barbarity, Western charity dominated the narrative in the newspaper reporting, and the Western press wrote either Tarzan stories, like in Congo, blacks killing whites, or in South Africa, the other way around. Other stories we focused, or my colleagues focused, on the Soviets are coming. I gave myself the task to see it from an Africa perspective, which I think every correspondent should do. I wanted to adapt and integrate and travel through the souls of other people who were foreign to me. I wanted to try to enter their souls, deep into their souls, try to understand what makes them tick, what is the past that shaped their souls. And that interest in Africa has kept me going for all the years. Stephen Ellis remarked, history matters. The Africa context is characterized by communalism, Ubuntu, a harmonious existence with nature, and a connection to both spirits and a God. Stephen Ellis highlighted with his spouse, Koert Lindijer, that without knowing faith, one cannot understand Africa. And I think coming from this part of the world, it's very important to take that in mind when one goes to Africa, either as an academic or as a journalist. History matters is what Stephen Ellis noted, including slave trade, colonialism, half a century of development aid, and of course the IMF World Bank dictates of the 80s and the 90s. As the American writer William Faulkner once said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Again, that's what Stephen Ellis emphasized and what he taught to me. Okay, now we go 1 year, 1 minute. In 1983, 2 decades after independence, the reliance on Western countries had paradoxically increased. A strict regime of austerity of IMF and World Bank were in place in many countries. If governments didn't have the money for education, didn't have the money for the health sector, well, forget about it. Then you simply have to forget about these sectors, while, of course, these were issues which inspired the independence struggle and what were the first things independent governments were doing after independence. This IMF World Bank period was a horrible period, and a period of general decline and implosion of states. And it was a mistake. And I think most of the economists and strategists of that time will that now finally they will admit it was a major mistake, which put Africa back for decades, maybe even. And as Stephen Ellis wrote, Africa inherited economies of extortion and plunder from colonial times. The liberalization of African economies under pressure from the IMF and other lenders strengthens the influence of informal networks and local mafia, up to the point that drug dealers may have had more influence than Western donors. Gosh, it was a time of wars and a time of wars to report on. And I covered many in the 80s and the 90s. Of course, there was the beginning, a chain reaction was created by Museveni in Uganda, who took over, followed by Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and then Laurent Kabila in 1997 in Congo. And at the same time, there in the Horn of Africa, you had rebel movements fighting in southern Sudan against the Arabized north of the country. And in Ethiopia, you had in the provinces of Tigray and Eritrea, you had rebel movements fighting against a very harsh communist regime in Addis Ababa. Thinking back about that time, it felt out of place being in a biblical landscape in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, having discussions under the portraits of Engels, Marx, Lenin, with student leaders who had transformed into guerrilla fighters, who had developed educated thoughts about agricultural practices in Albania, about peasantry, about class struggles. A bit odd, but still you had the feeling these were wars of liberations. They were horrible, but they had a purpose. In the 90s, I had to cover completely different wars. The ideological drive among fighters was not at all present in rebel movements like in Sierra Leone, Fodo Sanko, or in Liberia, Charles Taylor's. These were wars that predicted the liberation wars were wars that gave hope. The wars in West Africa, they symbolized decay, they symbolized implosion, they symbolized a trial of revenge, something terrible. Take Charles Taylor, and these are moments I will never forget. I crossed 1990, I think it was, from Ivory Coast into Liberia on a half-submerged boat. At the other hand, I was at the other side of the river. I was received by Charles Taylor's rebels. We passed villages where skulls of government troops were on sticks, to give you a horrible feeling, until we came to the camp where Charles Taylor were training boys, either barefooted, either with sticks, amulets around their necks with magic potions in it. And they were drugged. They were given marijuana, they were given alcohol, they were given amphetamines, leading them to commit acts of violence, including plundering, raping, torturing, and even cutting off genitals, beheading people, and sometimes eating body parts. And they dressed in all kinds of funny female clothes with wigs. And anyway, I was a horror movie to be there. Where did this hide and seek come from? As a journalist, you are supposed to have empathy, right, for situations, and you try to understand. In this case, I try to understand the positive side of cannibalism, because what better compliment can you give somebody that you want to eat part of him, isn't it? Because you want part of his character, you want part of his good behavior. I mean, please eat me if you can, because it's a compliment for me if you want to eat me. You have to go into history to understand how in the past certain elders were allowed to give orders to kids either to go to war or to go to certain rites of passage, not warlords who give you amphetamines and alcohol. Of course, coming back to Stephen Ellis, he wrote the book The Mask of Anarchy, and somewhere in a footnote he wrote somewhere that also Charles Taylor had been eating some pieces of human flesh to strengthen his spiritual powers. That's the difference between an academic and a journalist. The journalist puts that on top of the story. He would put it as a footnote in his book. And he was taken to court, by the way, for it. And as far as I understand, he won the case, right? He was allowed to write it. Anyway, these were hallucinations. These were stories which taught you a lot, but brought you in a different world and challenged you to understand why people behave the way they behave. The 90s were, apart from the wars, was a period of reform, political reforms, either by war or by political revolt, or because the pressure from outside was there for changes. The fight for pluralism in the beginning of the 90s, 1991, multi-party democracy returning to Africa was very much a topical issue to write about. The political scenes in the countries with a more stable political environment, like Kenya, like Tanzania, if you wish, and another few countries, there you saw young people, young politicians taking up the challenge, fighting for more pluralism. And it makes you think of the Gen Z, the Generation Z, which is challenging the political class right now. What they have in common is that it was full of hope, and it was very naive. Naive in a way that you think you can challenge an entrenched political class, and by just demonstrating, they will give up. What happened with the multi-party democracy, I think, yes, it has been more difficult for politicians to stay in power. They have to spend more money to bribe voters. Maybe they have to kill a bit more left and right, but still they are there. And sometimes when the kids come to me of Gen Z in Kenya and they say, very soon we will be presidents, very soon we will take over power, I feel like want to tell that story, guys. In the beginning of the 1990s, a similar movement was taking place. And yes, it brought improvement, but don't think we have just turned the corner because it's either multi-party or because youth are agitating against a golden belt of the president or a golden watch, or agitating against the arrogance of power. It will not make that change. I think you need more leverage. You need more of a revolt to push this political class out of power. Maybe more important at that time, in retrospect, was the economic liberalization. And guys, it was really very bad at that time in the 90s in Africa. In Sudan, there was no bread, there was no sugar. They made tea out of onions. In hotel rooms in Dar es Salaam, they even didn't have a lamp in your room. You sat in the darkness, or you sat in the toilet where there was one lamp. In Maputo, Mozambique, you had to order 2 days in advance. If you wanted to have a meal somewhere, you had to come with your own cutlery, and you gave the 2 days for the cook to go and try to buy the different ingredients of your meal so that 2 days later you could have a meal. These were terrible days, and drastic change was inevitable, and it came at a very big, harsh shock on the economic side. These were also the times when terms, and I'm sure Stephen will turn around in his grave if he hears these kind of things, when terms like the lost continent, or even worse, the hopeless continent, were invited even by The Economist. all, of course, terms in the Western world, not in Africa itself. Just imagine you call your own place a hopeless place. I mean, only outsiders could do it. And again, it shows something about the patronizing attitude of foreigners if it has to do with Africa. The most important result of these economic reforms, I think, in retrospect, was the return. I hear Stephen already telling me it was not a return, they were always there. But anyway, let's say the return of the private sector. In Nigeria, the commodity boards were broken down. Same thing happened in Kenya, where state companies were sold, by the way, bought by crooked politicians, which was the beginning of a middle class in Kenya. But anyway, I mean, the state withdrew to a large extent from the economy. And in a way, I think that helped democracy, because if you stifle economic freedom, you don't give people a chance to start their own business, whether it is selling flip-flops or whatever you want to sell. But if that has to be done by the state, you take freedom away from people. And as I remember, a chap in Nigeria very clearly told me, yes, the return of the free market, the fact that we can participate in the economy again, it helps to build democracy. That was one of the positive effects, of course, of the economic liberalization. Then I think the real period of growth started around the turn of the century, which has to do with many international events. And the major thing was that the East came in, China, India, Malaysia. They started investing large amounts of money in infrastructural projects, things the West used to do in the 60s, but didn't have money for anymore, didn't want to spend it. And that really made a big change. All my family, all my friends, their kids are now going to school, are going to universities. You don't see people walking barefooted anymore. The most visible poverty, which I remember from the 70s, have gone. I think you can only conclude if you see that comparison to the 70s and now that Africa has progressed tremendously. That what has been achieved in the last 45 years is, again, it's not turned the corner, I will not say that, but it has made things so much better than it used to be before. Go to a shopping mall in any African country and you can buy your latest book, your latest movies, your latest music. You can buy unhealthy food and get obesitas and get very unhealthy. It's all, the freedom is there to consume, and it is all there. Of course, as soon as you go out of these shopping centers, you will be on a road full with potholes. You will have a policeman who uses you like his ATM. You have to do with civil servants who are arrogant and who mistreat you. There is a lot of corruption. I think the free market also gave more chance to corruption than even before. The problem, of course, is that all these big infrastructure projects, the industries coming in, it didn't lead to that much kazi, to that much job opportunities. And up till now, you will find very well-educated people selling posters of Bob Marley or Obama in the slums of Nairobi. So you don't hear me saying, hooray, 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 we have solved all our problems. Because there are more people probably than before, but there are also more rich people than before. Maybe this is not a good platform to talk about it, but I still think we have to talk about the population growth. Everybody who goes to Africa, and if I see the average age is here, probably more than 40 years, you will be all seen as old pricks there, because the very simple fact is that if you look around, the majority of people are much younger than you are. In a village, in a town, wherever, it is 70% of the population is below 30 years. That also means if you travel wherever there was virgin bush, you will now find shambas. Wherever you did find agricultural fields, you now will see buildings. Forests are being cut like matchsticks. Pollution of rivers is, honestly, your gutters here are cleaner than some of the major rivers in East Africa. It is frightening. It is frightening how you see that the environmental damage, how it's kind of unrestricted taking place. And it has partly to do with we are losing our space, right? I mean, if we had 13 million people in 1975, 1973, and we now have 60 in Kenya, which is just one example. You see the problems coming, and countries like Rwanda and Burundi are already in problems because they are doing their agricultural activities with a kamba, with a rope around their waist, and then put it somewhere so they can cultivate their fields when they're very, very steep. Also, I think in a way we have become more antisocial. I remember being in Luanda somewhere in the 80s. I did a story a whole night. I walked around with street kids who were continuously attacked with glass, big pieces of glass, by passers-by. The same passers-by they tried to rob, by the way, but still, it happened. There was a war taking place on the streets of Luanda between kids and better off people. The police, of course, didn't do anything about it. And going then, at that time, I think I went to UNICEF, and people warned me, oh, this is going to be a problem in the future. We were talking about a few thousand people, street kids in Luanda. Now in African cities, there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of street kids permanently living on the streets in semi-crime areas. And again, it's frightening. And the way that poverty has increased is it's tremendously. This type of hopeless poverty, I was going to say, I hope, but I'm going to change this, I'm sure will not decrease. NGOs will not be able to fight this kind of poverty in the slums. I think Brazil is a good example where when the slums came up 150 years ago, they thought it was a temporary problem. And as we know, it is not. The world is divided between poor and rich. The world is divided with slums where you have their own economy. They will laugh at the price you pay for your shoes in the official economy. For them, it's a third of the price. Their culture is different from the affluent areas. Their language, they even have their own language in the slums. And you see more and more a separation between the well-off and, well, call it the poor, but it is worse than poor. The World Bank calls it the disadvantaged areas, which I still find very difficult to use. But in these disadvantaged areas, there is no confidence in politics. There is no confidence in the rule of law. There is no confidence in the police. Well, sometimes depends whether the crooks pay you more than the police pays you or something. But it's a completely different world, which falls out of the focus of whether it's NGOs or governments or journalists or whoever we are. And the rich people, you know, if you go to a good school in Nairobi, you don't go to the rural areas because your shoes may get dirty. And not to mention, you don't go to the slums where you can be attacked. At least the fear is there that you will be attacked. So that separation really is frightening. And we are now in a situation in Kenya where 500,000 private security guards protect the rich from the poor every day. That means that 1% of the population is employed to protect the assets and wealth of the other 1% against the other 98%. If that becomes our new life, at least in the urban area where there's these days is more poverty than in the countryside, I mean, again, it's frightening. It's frightening. The problem with the progress in the economy or the macro economy is it doesn't have an equal match in politics. Most politicians live in a completely different world from that of the common man. And I sometimes wish I had been there during colonial times, because I think that is the history that still lives on, the disdain by the rulers against ordinary people, the huge difference between a politician and what make the ordinary people tick, and especially the poor people tick. It's, for me, it's frightening, and I can't see how long this can continue. I'm not predicting revolutions, because revolutions lead to a lot of new problems, but I can't imagine that people in the slums who live on half of the amount for a month or what somebody else spends for his lunch in the center of the city, that kind of separation can continue. I simply can't, but maybe people are willing to accept that they live in a situation. But going back to the governance, of course, the issue is still bad governance. We still have bad governance. You think first about corruption. In Kenya, 1/3 of the national budget, 1/3 of the national budget disappears to corruption. These are figures given by the government. It's not me who came up with these figures. Again, we are being used as ATMs. We have civil servants who don't have a service mentality, no humility towards people. And you have state services. Yes, we have digitalized. Very easy to get a passport these days. But basic things like electricity, like water, we have contaminated water in cities. In Kenya, we have, just last weekend, we have the electricity disappearing for 24 hours because a monkey has done something with a cable, or a giraffe has hit a line somewhere. I mean, they always come up with bullshit stories, but the fact that a country which wants to industrialize, which wants to modernize, still can't get his act together as far as electricity is concerned. And Kenya has water power, has hydroelectric power, has wind power. So it's simply a question, they don't have their act together, and one way or another, they don't want to. Apart from politics and economy, I think it is very important for everybody to understand how Africa has changed as far as tabia, as far as culture, as far as the way we deal with each other. It starts, of course, with gender. It has to do with fashion. No longer English dresses for women, no shapeless trousers for men, no Homburg hats for men anymore, no short Afro hair for teenagers. They have all gone. And now genders walk hand in hand. Rastas or rap, it's all there. The hip hop, the youth culture dominates the streets of many major cities in the continent. For everybody who has experienced that, from a very, call it, conservative culture to what is now, it is, as somebody said to me, a revolution is taking place. A revolution is taking place. People who remember Kenya before 1990 will no longer recognize it. That's what a young Kenyan actress and a singer told me, I think in 2012. And she was acting in a TV series called Sugar, and she was called Misbehave. Misbehave. Their Sugar focuses on the life of young people, their love, their complicated sex, the life at university and the lusty nightlife, the way individuals fought to realize their own dreams. And they did so in a rapidly changing world in which parents no longer had the final say. AIDS and homosexuals undermined old habits, and the internet, of course, offered an escape route for everybody who didn't want to go along with the old habits. As Misbehave told me, women have achieved such emancipation that we no longer wait for men to approach us. We actively pursue relationships ourselves. 2 decades ago, couples would hesitate to walk down the streets arm in arm. Today, some even have the audacity to kiss in public. Is that not progress? End of quote. Another aspect of the same subject is, I read, I think last year in the Kenyan Daily Nation, a story, a Kenyan demographic health survey showed that the number of mothers-only households had risen to 31% in urban areas and even to 36% in rural areas. So just imagine coming from where your family is the base of everything, that is the community that shapes you. Now you have already 1/3 of families being run by one person, mostly by women. Now, this, I think that still Kenyans are very shocked about such changes, and it is not only in Kenya happening in other countries as well. These are people who grew up in the context of Ubuntu, with the community being paramount, with men taking the lead. Now, many Kenyan men feel emasculated. They struggle with the disappearance of their traditional leading role in society. Globalization, individualization, and Western traditions challenge African manners more and more. Kenyan men are losing their balls in the process. And this, I think, again, if you experience them, and I know it happens also in this country, but these are such major changes, which I think will have a big influence in the future. Of course, coming back to Gen Z, these are also people, the Generation Z, who are challenging cultural, social convention. Yes, they're educated. Yes, they still respect elders, but they don't disappear under the bed when the head teacher comes to visit their parental home. And I think up till not too long ago, that was the case. They have a voice, they respect, but they don't keep their mouths shut. Now, the same thing with the strictly separated age groups. You see them crumbling. The elders, the authority of the elders of the past is disappearing. In the past, when the elders did beat the holy drums, everybody fell under their magic spell. Now everybody has their own individual dreams to fulfill. Major, major change. With communalism on the retreat, and with a new prosperity for some, it seems to me that we are heading for a full-blown consumer society. 30 years ago, in Samburu area, that's northern Kenya, a former nomadic community, traditional life, communal life. I saw 30 years ago, for the first time, that a padlock was introduced there. In the past, of course, what you owned was your cattle, right? Everybody could see your cattle. There was nothing to hide. But now you saw people getting metal boxes with a padlock to keep their own beets in their metal box, to put their packet of Omo there and their shuka, their piece of cloth, private ownership. Don't touch my stuff, it's mine. In my personal experience, is that idea of consumerism, that desire to own the new telephone, to own the Nike, that is what changes the people, the mentality, the behavior more than anything else. Now you have screaming billboards that push you into the consumer paradise, into the world, in the beautiful world of consumer pleasure, on the way to a carefree future. In short, dare to live, be yourself, be yourself, be yourself, which is very much different from what it used to be. Africa in the world. Yeah, Africa is not as connected to the West, to the white world anymore as it used to be. China saw an economic opportunity in Africa, still because of the new demographics, wants to do business, and not only China, middle powers, Turkey, Iran, Brazil, United Arab Emirates, of course. They're all coming up. They're giving huge amounts of money. They're doing business, and they are, in many ways, the countries that determine wars or political developments, especially the UAE. Stephen Ellis wrote, decades of civilian missions like development projects have left many Africans with something like an inferiority complex because of development aid. Now leaders are definitely more self-assured than they were before. I still remember when a Dutch minister could pass by, the leaders were trembling. Oh God, our development aid, 10, 20 million guilders or whatever is going to be withdrawn. They were shit scared when Western ministers came up. Now they even don't go to the airport anymore to receive these ministers. So yes, the dependency syndrome is disappearing, but everything has another side as well. Of course, I think African leaders are walking with their heads in the clouds, because after the turn of the century, China coming in with a lot of money, that has disappeared, at least not as much as there was before. Economic growth has slowed down. Debt servicing is 40% of GDP, 40. And let's not forget that the lockdowns connected to COVID created a lot of havoc in Africa, and we are still seeing the effects of that. So one could predict that probably we are heading for some social unrest in the future. With 60% of the population below 25 years, with little absorption of educated youth in the formal economy, we live on a time bomb. I hope Stephen allows me to say this. Somewhere something will explode. Gen Z, at least in East Africa, they don't run away to Europe. They want to stay there. They want to do their things inside a democratic order. But somewhere, the desperation of all these well-educated, unemployed people may lead to nasty developments. The Gen Z works within the democratic system. The problem is that the democratic system doesn't solve any of these problems. I've been talking about developmental problems don't necessarily have to do with democracy. In the last 20 years, we had something like 410 elections. 20 years, 410 elections. And most of these elections have been contested. Some even resulted in wars or very nasty conflict. Only 15% of the elections in Africa in the past 2 decades have ended happily. So there is this development that raises the specter of democratic backsliding. frequently civilian governments does not result in good governance. Civilian governance even results in bad governance. And then the military alternative becomes very attractive. I think this is partly what has been happening in the Sahel countries. Of course, every region, every country is different, but civilian rule didn't bring the progress in the Sahelian countries that was expected in the 80s, the 90s, when civilian rule returned there. So don't put your bet on democracy. That's what I'm saying. I feel ashamed to say this, but I'm not saying put your bet on military regimes, but democracy doesn't lead to development. Democracy it raises a lot of expectations, but it doesn't always fulfill the expectations. We live, I think, in a post-colonial society. That's for Africa. It's maybe for you the same thing here. With many structures of that time still present. In Kenya, we have the government-appointed chiefs, not traditional chiefs, but appointed by the government basically to spy on the populations. They are still there. We still have the big men, twice capital, which rule with a mix of fear and put the people down. We still have police who continuously harass us, not only squeezing us for money, but just being arrogant bastards, which does not give you any sympathy for them and which continually gives you the idea, I'm being so oppressed, I'm being suppressed, this is my enemy, this is not my government. The arrogance of power, in short, it's disgusting, but it's still there. I mean, just imagine, we had in Kinshasa recently, there was a breakout in the Makala prison, and the prison guardians or the police, don't ask me, maybe it had been the army, they just shot 129 people dead. Just like that, as if human life doesn't have very much value, as if it is colonial times. I mean, Nigeria, there was Gen Z demonstrations there. They picked up some kids from the streets, they imprisoned them, and they even charged them with something they could have been given the death sentence. I mean, are we killing our own youth that we shoot at them? In Kenya, we shoot at them. We had 60 people dead or abducted or whatever of the Gen Z demonstrators. I mean, what the hell are we doing if we are killing our own youth, the well-educated people who are there to bring us further in life? Lastly, yes, we still have wars. Wars seem to be part of human mankind, but the wars are different. I still think that the wars in the 80s, the ones in Ethiopia, the one in South Sudan, were wars of liberation, were wars by movements against the central power. Now you see wars within the central power. Ethiopia, where one of the most criminal wars, at least this century, but maybe even longer, with 700,000 people dead, 700,000 people dead, took place in Tigray. And right now we have the war in Sudan, which again is a war, a contradiction, a conflict within the center of power. Sudan, and I can't be here without mentioning Sudan, because it is absolutely, absolutely horrible what is happening there. And it is so disgusting and so disappointing that it seems nothing is being done about it from the outside world. I mean, either from African countries or outside. The destruction of infrastructure there goes along with the erosion of the unique social fabric and hospitality that characterizes Sudan's society. And I know all of us all of you have done research somewhere and you will say, oh, the people in Burundi, these are the nicest people possible. Well, honestly, the guys from Northern Sudan, their hospitality, there is water on the streets to drink for everybody. When you arrive somewhere, first a glass of water, then a glass of karkade, then something to bite, and then they will say, can we prepare some food for you? It's desert hospitality. And you can hardly imagine that survives when the whole social fabric of that country is getting kaput, is being destroyed. And you sometimes wonder, and I have Sudanese friends, refugees on my compound, you sometimes wonder, maybe being dead, you have been the lucky one, because you inherit a country which everything is kaput, 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 and especially this social structure. My experience with conflict has taught me that when the madness really is set loose, which is the case in Sudan, people feel no restraint at all to dismantle the state structure anymore. They lose the sense of belonging to one's country. The collective identity is being pushed aside by hatred and by cynicism. And that's exactly what is happening in Sudan. Apart from whether there are 10,000 people dead, or that is not the issue. Maybe the dead ones are the lucky ones. But that this country, it is drowning, and nobody outside is helping. And I'm not the international expert to judge this, but it really seems that the world can only deal with two wars, and it's definitely not the one in Sudan. But you always have to end with a positive note, isn't it? But far away from the central power, there is, I'm not saying, Stephen, I'm not saying there's a new Africa emerging, but there is another Africa emerging. And I think that is the one of the young people that thrives of the young generation that thrives of the freedom to do business, one that is run by young, educated, middle-class people, another Africa that has completely embraced internet, which is freedom. Don't forget how important that is in an authoritarian state, that you can suddenly express yourself on internet and you have free communication and you can do business in that way. With this internet, these young people take their freedom from the old guard, the freedom that they have missed out for so many decades. There will be more seasons of rain to come from these people. And once more, we are looking for that inspiring, that stimulant smell. And everybody who has been here in Africa knows, and that first drop of the rain falls on the dry ground. Hui, that is something that gives you a lot of inspiration. So yes, there is a new rainy season coming, and with that new rainy season, there will emerge a new group of people who will take Africa forward. So keep it up.
Thank you, Koert.
Karibu sana bwana. You want me to sit or can I? Anyway, endelea, continue.
Yeah, no, you will sit a bit.
It's okay.
Yeah. Thanks so much for this exposition, taking us through the decades, the experience, so much to learn. Some a bit on the despairing side. Thanks for ending on a very positive note, because on the despairing side, I remember the words of Chinua Achebe, things fall apart. Say, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is lost upon the world. He didn't end it on an optimistic note, but thanks for this optimistic note. I know there are burning questions. I know you are eager to ask for clarification of why did things happen. But please hang on just a minute, because I have 3 invited speakers also who will reflect on this from their perspective. I have with us first, I'll call to the high table with the high chair. Jelte van Weeren is the director of the Department for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. He's going to reflect on this, not from the journalistic perspective for public consumption, or from Stephen's academic, always hiding it under the footnote. No. Dutch Development Corporation in all of this. Tell us a little bit.
Thank you very much. First, I must say how honored I am and how humbled I am to be reacting to Koert, but also to be invited to speak briefly as possible, during the 10th anniversary lecture of Stephen Ellis. When I came back from South Africa after my first posting for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1994, after the elections in South Africa took place, I took up a job in the Department for Africa. And one of the shining examples of how to think about Africa and how to work with Africa was Stephen. And I admired him for that. And I was also very proud that when I was in the Department of Southern Africa, that I was allowed to be involved in making sure that Stephen lent his intellect to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So I have very fond memories of that bond. But the same thing goes for Koert. I was privileged to be in Kenya for a number of years, and was also one of the persons that I know of that really authentically tries to understand Africa from an African perspective, which I've been trying for a long time as well, and I'm not nearly as good as you are in these things. But for me, those are examples that I try to grab onto and live with in my day-to-day work. And when I hear Koert speaking, I recognize a lot of things that he said in his presentation. When looking at Africa, my impressions, but also the impressions of more of my colleagues, tend to go up and down from optimism to pessimism. Or as a British colleague of mine recently, when I met him in Zambia, told me, it's sort of a perpetual cycle between despair and hope. And I literally end with hope, because that's also the thing that I like to do, is to see the things more on the positive side than may be possible, some here and there. So we are caught between being impressed by Africa's potential on the one hand and concerned for the challenges of the continent on the other at the same time. And there is a historical continuity to this as well, because about 20 years ago, our Africa policy was called Strong People, Weak States. Now, furthermore, in reaction to what Koert said about the image of African politicians walking around with their head in the clouds, which I think is a very strong one, I would like to add that for me, for decades now, these politicians are still the same people. Post-colonial political elites in African countries have been remarkably resilient. And I recently revisited Kenya, and I found out that the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Kenya right now was already a minister when I was there 24 years ago. These people never change. They are always the same elites, the same people that keep on coming back and back, and they are resilient and they adapt every time. And pinning hope on a new generation, that's a very good thing to do, but in my experience, that's risky as well. Yes, the potential is absolutely there. And in same cases, as like the civilian revolution in Sudan, results are achieved. But these results prove to be very fragile. And in many places, young people decide that their chances might be bigger if they just blend in and copy the behavior of their elite. This is what I saw when I was my last job in South Sudan, being an ambassador there. I saw that a lot of young people actually were trying to do that. And they became even worse than the people in the elite in terms of the oppression and reduction of civic space in that country. But for us, Africa truly is a continent of the future, with this youthful, aspirational population eager to assert themselves and insisting to be heard and be taken seriously. And we saw this last year, as Koert already said, in Kenya and in Nigeria. Gen Z took to the streets to be heard about governance, corruption, the increased cost of living. And on the positive side, aspirations for change from the young electorate recently led to democratic transfers of power in countries like Senegal and Botswana. And the ruling ANC in South Africa has been forced to share power in a government of national unity. To me, those are very positive examples of change that happen as well. But at the same time, conflict, instability persists in many corners of the continent. In Sudan, a coalition of warring parties fell apart and overturned a popular revolution. Humanitarian aid is blocked, and right now 6 million people are facing the risk of starvation. And in the Sahel, Koert mentioned it already, young people took to the street to celebrate military juntas taking on the jihadists with Russian support, before being silenced by the same governments to prevent them from turning their anger on them. And meanwhile, the European Union struggles and finds it increasingly difficult to find its role in supporting African partners to take their responsibility. So we are faced with dilemmas on how to engage with governments with disputed legitimacy. On Sudan, a resolution calling for a ceasefire backed by all 3 African Security Council members was vetoed by Russia, while the Sudanese armed forces at the same time thanked the Russians for protecting their sovereignty. And while international relations face a fundamental shift in the balance of power, several governments in and around Europe turn their attention inward, instead of playing a role in the world to address some of these issues proactively. In the Netherlands, this comes with serious budget cuts, facing international cooperation, diplomacy, research, and education. So, in order to deal with this proverbial perpetual cycle between hope and despair, I was very happy to be given a chance to think about, but also write about, how to deal with the enormous diversity, potential, and the rapid changes on the African continent. Our Africa strategy was part of the coalition agreement of the previous government and submitted to Parliament shortly before that government became demissionary. It was adopted by the outgoing Parliament with broad support from the left to the right. In recent parliamentary debates, majority support for the strategy was articulated in sessions dealing with trade, aid, and foreign affairs. And it's now for us to see how policy changes and cuts to our budget, staffing, and maybe even embassies will affect the implementation of this strategy. What is clear is that, like Africa and our relations with our African partners, our 10-year strategy will certainly outlive our current government. Now, the contrasts discussed before between hope and despair, between our worries about governance and our trust in the people of Africa, have been well reflected in our strategy. It is not a whole of government strategy only, it is a whole of society strategy. It was originally a response to our business community that sees Africa's potential, but they also knew that they need public-private partnerships, diplomatic support, and knowledge to navigate a complex business environment to unlock the potential that is there. They also need advice and people watching them to ensure that they do the right things and that they do the things in the right way. And to ensure that our promise to positively impact people and planet, and not only profits, proves to be more than just a slogan. And for this, we need you. We need journalists, we need the academic world, we need researchers who are passionate about Africa. We know that if we want to be relevant to Africa, we need to know Africa. We need to understand, we need to empathize. We need to continuously study and report on Africa so that we are not stuck in stereotypes and assumptions. That is crucial to get any closer to our goal of more equitable relationships. But please, if you are so passionate about Africa, do not focus on fundamental research only. That is less relevant in relations between Africa and the Netherlands. So we need broad subjects and more relevant research to be done. Let's join in conversations with our African friends. Let's connect what the Netherlands has to offer and what is needed by Africans in the context of their local realities. And let's be open and receptive to what Africans have to offer us. In this time of scarcity, we may need to be selective and we may need to focus, but we will definitely need each other. And if we do that well, perhaps after these times of austerity, there will be times again of broadening opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Staat hij hier?
Jozef.
Ik schuifel op, dan kan jij hier blijven zitten.
Okay.
Your questions in this regard, your comments, please be noting them. because I'd like to call on Abdurrahman Idrissa, a political scientist who is fast embracing history. Amen. Don't worry. His specialization is on democratization and political Islam in Africa. He's worked on migration, he's worked on security issues and traditional governance in the Sahel borderland. So in all of this, he's going to focus much more on what is happening in the Sahel on governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yinka. Thank you all for being here. And thank you very much, Koert, for your powerful speech. What you said about Sudan reminded me that 2 years ago, I met a Sudanese man who was living in Niamey, the capital of Niger. We talked a lot about his experiences. He was in his mid-40s, which means he grew up and came of age in the Sudan of Omar al-Bashir, a military leader, and Hassan al-Turabi, a clerical leader. He gave me vivid descriptions of his early education under the al-Bashir/al-Turabi regime, which he described as a fascistic Islamist government propped by harsh military despotism and wrapped in Arab supremacism and anti-Black racism. Quite the nice dispensation. He told me of how he was indoctrinated in the ruling ideology, how he was sent to study in Algeria in the late 1990s, how he was at first shocked by all that he saw there, people smoking, drinking on terraces, women in skirts and pants, how he then took a liking to it and realized how bad things were in Sudan, and how he ended up ascribing the difference between Sudan and Algeria to Algeria's French legacy. That's when he decided to learn French in earnest, because he identified it with democracy, liberalism, the open society, everything that Sudan was not. In fact, he told me things about being the citizen of a democratic republic and how valuable that was in itself, which people around him in Niger took for granted. Sadly, when looking at the situation in Niger today, he told me he decided to settle down in that country because it looked like Sudan. Sudan is like the Sahel, really, but had benefited from the same French influence he saw in Algeria, that was his perception, and made a democracy out of it. I was amazed. At the time, that was like 2022, 2021, 2022, Sudan was the only country in Africa where young people were actually dying for democracy. Elsewhere on the continent, it was not difficult to find young people who were pining for despots and military rule. And one cannot help but ask the question, how come? Well, one simple response is that the story of Sudan seemed to be the reverse of that of many countries in Africa, certainly those in the Sahel. The Sahel countries and Sudan had the same militarized and successful developmental political settlement through the 1970s, 1980s. Then, in the 1990s, the Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, democratized virtually in lockstep. At that same point, Sudan was being taken over by the Islamist totalitarianism I have been talking about. 20 years later, everyone was disappointed by their own regime. The Sudanese by the Islamist totalitarianism, which over time had become less totalitarian but more corrupt, or actually more openly corrupt, and the Sahelians by multi-party democracy, which over time had become less multi-party, or more to the point, less inclusive and more corrupt. So there is a clear sense that what the Enga really was about was governance. If we go back to that moment in the 1990s, which you described when you spoke about meeting young people full of hope about democracy, anger and hope were already about the fact that the military regimes were unable to provide effective governance and the world of opportunity that it could unlock. There was hope that democracy would bring remedies. Not only would the leadership no longer be monopolized by one group, i.e. members of a single ruling party or a military clique, but their power would be checked by the rule of law and balanced institutions, and they would be accountable to the electorate and civil society. Thus, issues of governance would be solved in the public square. Perhaps I'm less severe than you, Koert, about the result of this hope or dream. Some of this did come to pass. For example, there was a decent amount of rule of law that took shape, something that was kind of really lacking in the previous dispensation in the Sahel. But governance problems specific to the rivalrous nature of multi-party democracy, the partisanship, the politicization, the polarization did quickly get in the way of the ideal operation of democratic institutions. By the mid-2000s, I would say, there was a common perception in Mali and Niger, though not in Burkina Faso, that the political class, a product of democracy, which came to be seen as what democracy was all about, had made a mess of governance and foreclosed the future. And thus a strong man was needed. Not in Burkina Faso, because they had a strong man at the time, Blaise Compaoré, and rather thought that democracy was needed. And in fact, in 2014, they rose up against and kicked out Blaise Compaoré. Unfortunately, that has not lasted. As a point of fact, a majority of Nigerians supported President Mamadou Tanja's attempt in 2009 to establish a constitutional dictatorship, and they attributed his removal via a coup d'etat in January 2010 to a plot by the French, of course, because it's always the French in the Sahel, to foist democracy on an unwilling people. I remember I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to debunk that opinion, which was ubiquitous around me at the time, and it was very rarely successful. Malians say the same thing when ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, and the international community, that is the Western States and the United Nations, compelled coup maker Amadou Haya Sanogo to return power to the civilians in 2012. You get the picture. That being said, I don't think the Sahel would have fallen to military rule without two factors which were external to it, at least in large part. First, there are the conflicts involving jihadists in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and Tuareg separatists. I never know how to pronounce that word. Separatists? Separatists in Mali. Those conflicts would not have happened if Algeria did not corner its jihadist foes of the 1990s, its Black Decade, into northern Mali, thus seeding Islamist militancy over there. And if NATO did not help insurrectionists destroy the regime of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, driving Tuareg militants into Mali because they were living in Libya under his protection. And second, there is the upsetting of the international order by the rivalry between the West and Russia, which made pandering to putschists more important than punishing them. I was asked in Bamako and Niamey by people who were genuinely astonished. Sorry. Why the West, why the US, this stupendously powerful entity, were groveling to the juntas. That's how they saw it. My hypothesis was that at bottom, the West did not really believe in democracy in a place like the Sahel, and I guess it has the same excuse as those Sahelians who also did not believe in it. Messy governance, corruption, plus the image of Africa in the West as well. Although the ready reason was just that fear of the Sahel countries failing for Russia kept the West on its toes. Now the West has lost on the two fronts. It did not help save democracy in the Sahel, and the Sahel countries have become Russian pawns. Let me end with two remarks. First, today, society in those countries is divided between those who, for various reasons, adhere to militarized governance, which is as bad as you described it, Koert, and has some similarities with what went on in Sudan in the 1990s. Is certainly the ideological mania in the Sahel. It's nationalism. In the Sudan, it was Islamism. And those who are now discovering that one should want democracy, not just for its potential dividends in terms of good governance and the public goods and services which it brings, but for itself. Now I'm hearing people in the three countries saying the same things about being the citizen of a democratic republic as the Sudanese man I met in Niamey, and with the same warmth of passion and emotion. Second, I think the greatest responsibility in this, and thus the biggest disappointment, lies with Africa's intelligentsias, and those of the Sahel, obviously, whose job it is to think over solutions for inventing efficient governance fit for Africa, and who mostly prefer the ivory tower or the blame game. I do know it's a brutal world out there. Your speech made it quite clear, and I know it by experience. I probably lost a decade worth of life expectancy trying to help South Niger and the Sahel, and we see the result, at least for now. Still, there is no excuse. One has to do what one has to do. Thank you.
Thank you. You have a seat. Last but not the least, from an inclusive development perspective, Africa in the world today, Mandipa Ndlovu, also of the African Studies Center, a research analyst, policy consultant, appointed to the Ibrahim Index of African Governance Youth Advisory Council. You're welcome to the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start by premising what I'm going to say with a statement. And the statement is, the world is currently in polycrisis and Africa is not immune to its effects. So please keep this at the back of your minds as I speak. So I have 5 reflections today, and I'm going to start with the historical matters that were spoken about. Governance in Africa cannot and should not be decoupled from the legacy of colonialism. The arrogance of power that was spoken about has a legacy, and it's a learned behavior on how to govern in many African countries, from colonialism and colonial administrators, just now seen as neocolonialism. The multi-party governance systems that we see brought hope, but failed to dismantle entrenched political patronage that continues to have rent-seeking in governments of power today, as well as in countries that continue to face economic decline. Countries like Mali, countries like Malawi, Senegal, not Mali, countries like Malawi, Senegal, Zambia, and recently Botswana, where the opposition has managed to legitimately win power from the liberation ruling parties, are continuous outliers. Where governance sees progress continuing to stall on the African continent, as per the Index for African Governance in 2024, we need to focus on strengthening democratic institutions, where we prioritize the rule of law, which includes security sector reform, even in civilian rule. We need to strengthen as well and enforce electoral integrity, and we need to increase spaces for meaningful engagement, especially among young people and the marginalized. On the topic of young people, I like to call this Africa's demographic puzzle. We have a demographic puzzle in Africa that influences our democracies, and it's a big one. 42% of global youth will be African in the next 5 years. The total working age population is set to grow by 70% to 450 million in the next 10 years. And by 2050, Africa will become home to 461 million young people aged between 15 to 24. The current median age on the continent is 19. According to the Afrobarometer recently, 33% of young people view unemployment as the biggest challenge facing Africa today. In the case of South Africa, which just happens to be the worst country facing an unemployment crisis, despite being the 28th largest economy globally and the second in Africa, South Africa has the worst unemployment rate at 32.1%. In the third quarter of 2024, this was measured. And worse still, 31% of South Africans have only some secondary education, and only 12.2%, according to the National Statistics Center, have been exposed to higher education. Overall, we're also seeing a 20% decline in the education indicator for governance, according to the 2024 Ibrahim Index for African Government. governance. 90% of jobs on the continent remain informal, and 20% of young people are neither employed nor in education nor in training. So it's clearly a puzzle and a very complex one to put together. Only Angola and Madagascar's NEET youth see a figure that is below 10% in Africa. A lot of the solutions that have been brought to the fore have been TVET training, so technical and vocational and education training, but there are challenges that remain, as UNESCO reports show. So there's continual structuring of the informal and vocational space. Guaranteeing TVET access remains a problem, and inclusion to vulnerable groups is a problem. Strengthening the education, vocational training, and employment continuum is a problem. And strengthening the management of TVET capacities with TVET stakeholders is a problem. So we face a situation in Africa where there needs to be a prioritization of policies that focus on skills for development, job creation, and entrepreneurial support for the youth, which leverages the tech savviness of this generation and the innovative potential that they hold. There's also a need to dig deeply into the understanding of causal reasons behind the disconnect between harnessing the potential that we're seeing in Africa and the need for skills that meet market needs on the continent. The third reflection that I have is on economic growth versus equality. We're continuously seeing in Africa, in every single sector that you look at, in regards to growth and development, a need to bridge the gap between the inequality, well, the equality of outcomes with the equality of process. And many people are left behind in this. We celebrate advancements and outcomes, but we continually ignore the process. And in the digital space, the urban space, and others, we need to focus on evolving inclusively. Otherwise, we face a situation where the celebrated and heralded African continental free trade area, which poses a 2.5 trillion market opportunity, will mean very little to people on the ground. And consumerism will not be long-lasting if people continue to be structurally and economically disenfranchised or insecure. Fourthly, I would like to reflect a little bit on global relations and African agency. So Africa's revolving relationship with the world demands assertive leadership to avoid Eastern or Western dependency. With the G20 head being held by South Africa, Trump's anger on the BRICS currency, and continued discovery of mineral resources on the continent drawing attention to Africa, there is a need to have balanced partnerships that prioritize African agency and long-term sustainability over short-term gains. And this is necessary if there's a chance for Africa's success. Here, there's an opportunity for Africa and Africanists, of whom I assume are all in this room, to advocate for an Africa that operates in a multipolar, multi-crisis, and poly-crisis world, to take the continent and people that engage with the continent from a situation of volatility to vision, uncertainty to understanding, complexity to clarity, and ambiguity to agility. There will be no need to or interest in civil unrest from Africans as long as these issues can be adequately addressed. Lastly, I'd like to reflect on emerging opportunities and hope. We're all ending on hope today. An Africa driven by an educated, internet-savvy young demographic, which offers hope for innovative governance and economic transformation, is possible if we support digital innovation to help leapfrog governance goals, insist on funding education that meets market needs, where there is no internet freedom without electricity to charge devices currently. If we buttress infrastructural development needs against the equality of outcomes. And lastly, if we continue to cultivate a culture that prioritizes ordinary African lives as grievable, both by leaders and by multiple stakeholders, so that the continent's dreams can be contextually understood and strategized for with equal and equitable outcomes for all. Thank you.